name is Teodosii Ruskov,
Hi, I'm Sworup Adhikari.
and today we are talking about Sanskrit. So, Sworup, tell me a little about yourself.
My name is Sworup Adhikari, and by profession, I'm a mechanical engineer. But I've been, putting my hands into South Asian philosophy and literature for quite some time. Mostly, my focus on Indian philosophy. But within that, I've read a few books that are not philosophy, but are still classical Indian for some time. And I would say it's been about 7 years that I've been putting my hand into this. So, yeah, that's pretty much from me, I guess. What about you?
My name is Teodosii Ruskov. I am a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and I study Sanskrit and Pali. So far, I've mostly worked on early Buddhism, less philosophy and more aesthetics. So narrative, Jataka stories, other forms of Buddhist storytelling. Increasingly, I'm interested in rasa and other aesthetics, in natya, right, in drama, and kind of the artistic world of classical India.
Yeah, nice. How did you sort of get into Sanskrit as a topic?
So I started studying Buddhism, and it becomes very clear anytime you're studying anything in India that Sanskrit is sort of the key to everything. It is the entrance into a whole intellectual world, and so really by learning Sanskrit, you actually get access to all of these texts that are sometimes poorly translated, sometimes just very difficult to translate. Sanskrit started as a means to an end, and now it's just something I really like. So.
Nice. So let's begin with a very basic question. What actually is Sanskrit? Give me like the basic thing that I need to know before we get into more detailed stuff.
So maybe you can tell me what you already know.
Okay.
Or rather, we can share with the audience what the sort of traditional account of Sanskrit is.
Yeah, sure. So I guess Sanskrit within the, let's say, the Indian tradition has always been regarded as an eternal language, right? It's a language that is the language of the gods, right? It's the language that the Vedas are written in, and much of the other texts that that is revered in the Indian subcontinent. Many of the Puranas, the Itihasas, many of these are written in Sanskrit, and it's kind of considered how the language of reality, kind of, because it's sort of in many Indian philosophical schools to actually describe reality as what it is in some sense. So there's a lot of talk about how the words in Sanskrit are eternal, and then therefore the objects that they represent, the artha is also eternal. So the shabda and the artha are both eternal. Many schools, like maybe the Mimamsa school, has a lot of interesting thoughts about Sanskrit and how it's like the progenitor of all languages. So traditionally it has always been like a high language that people use to discuss philosophy, religion, and literature, and so on. I guess if from the traditional point of view, it's just like the language that you discuss important things in, right? What do you have to say on this?
So linguistically speaking, if we want to look at it that way, Sanskrit is one product of this larger language family. We could call it Proto-Indo-European, which is this hypothetical language that existed at some point in Central Asia and that has since split up into many of the language families we know today, including nearly all the European ones. So the Slavic language family split out from Proto-Indo-European. The Romance languages did as well, so did the Germanic ones. And so Sanskrit belongs to this Indo-Aryan split. The earliest Indo-European language that we have attested, I believe, is Vedic Sanskrit. So Vedic Sanskrit, linguistically, the language of the Vedas, is our evidence of, our attestation of, old Indo-Aryan. So Vedic Sanskrit is is an interesting case. We don't have written evidence of the Vedas, but we do have a remarkably conservative oral transmission, which allows us to say a lot about what the language was like thousands of years ago. And you can tell that Vedic Sanskrit is very old. It has very complicated grammar. It has very complicated vocabulary, much of which we don't exactly know what it means yet. But often when we're thinking about Sanskrit as a language of cultural production, as a language of philosophy, as a language of literature, we aren't talking about Vedic Sanskrit. We're talking about Panini's Sanskrit, right? Classical Sanskrit. This sort of form of Sanskrit that was spoken at some point potentially thousands of years after the Vedas were composed, and that even at that time was fairly diverse. So Sanskrit is supposed to be this one single eternal language that's always the same, and all the words have the same meanings, and the grammar is always the same, the structure of the grammar. But we know from Patanjali's Mahabhashya that people where Patanjali was living thought that the people where Panini was living spoke nicer Sanskrit.
Oh, okay.
He points to Panini as having uniquely beautiful Sanskrit, as Sanskrit that should be emulated. Of course, Panini writes the Ashtadhyayi, which is this very comprehensive, very difficult to understand, grammar of the Sanskrit language. And so this, in many ways, becomes the standard language that we're talking about when we talk even about the Itihasas, right? The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, or the Puranas. A lot of things that Buddhists wrote in Sanskrit. A lot of philosophy that was written by Mimamsakas and the Nyaya school, etc.
Pushing a little bit on the the idea that Sanskrit is part of this larger language group that we hypothesize as Proto-Indo-European. We talked about how many of the Romance languages, Slavic languages, Persian, and Sanskrit, they share a common root somewhere in Central Asia. And what I find interesting is how there are still remnants of that similarity that we can find even now when we're talking like in English or when I'm talking in Nepali or something, which obviously, has some derivative ideas from Sanskrit. And one of the most interesting examples was how the English word for ignite, right, which comes from the Latin ignis, is related to the Sanskrit agni, right?
I mean, it's even so. I'm a native Bulgarian speaker. The Slavic, in basically every Slavic language, the word for fire is ogun, which could not be closer to agni if it tried.
Exactly, and also, with regards to even numbers, right? Family members are pretty much the same. There's some variation of mother is, so, the number 3 is very, very famous. The number 2 is very famous, because Sanskrit, you could have dwa, and then you could have a 3 being trini, and then 3 sounds a lot like trini.
And in Bulgarian, it's idno, dve, tri. It's exactly the same,
Yeah. So it's still sort of very much in modern day life that we can find these connections, and we're talking about how historians have used many of these similarities. I think it was around the first time the British came to India and then started looking at some of the Indian languages that they thought that it's very similar, that we started getting this idea that it's united in some way. Another famous example I think that I know of is for the word water in Sanskrit, ap, right? And so it's the same in Persian, which I've been told by my Persian friends. And then Punjab as a region is the land of 5 waters because it's Panj in Aap, right? and so, you get these connections, and the Persians sort of, they have a similar language, I guess, to Vedic Sanskrit in the Avestan languages. And so how are historians kind of making these connections, and how does it proceed historically, or how does it proceed in an academic sense? This hypothesizing that all of these must have come from like a similar source. How does that work?
So I guess, are you asking for why historians are doing it, or how
historians are doing it mostly?
I guess this is some linguistics that's above my pay grade and maybe above our pay grade. But the idea behind it is that linguists are technically not. Linguists assume that languages develop, and so that Sanskrit has moved forward, and that goes against the idea that Sanskrit is eternal. But because Sanskrit has changed so much, linguists are not comfortable saying that Sanskrit had these words forever and ever, and they moved away from Sanskrit into these other languages. So generally, the kind of mode of linguistic thought is to find a common ancestor. That is generally what explains why different languages would have words in common, because at some point they were the same language. We can also kind of, theoretical linguists will look at, or historical linguists will look at certain shifts are are preserved. So we can say pretty reliably that words changed from Proto-European into Sanskrit in a very kind of regular sort of way, in a similar way that they did changing into Slavic languages. So there's certain vowel shift, consonant shifts, morphological shifts on the level of verbs and nouns that are conserved across many languages. And so, again, this is a little bit above my pay grade, but it's very much a science. It's almost the same way that a biologist, an evolutionary biologist, would think about species with common ancestors. The sort of genetic reasoning works in that way.
Nice. So now we come to Patanjali's Bhashya, you said. He mentions that people from where Panini was living, the northwest, let's say, speak better Sanskrit, and that's the Sanskrit they should emulate. And you also mentioned a lot of the Buddhist texts have Sanskrit in them, and then we do find some variation between classical sort of Hindu Sanskrit. That's the Sanskrit of the Puranas, maybe the Sanskrit of the Itihasas, and then a lot of Buddhist literature as well, because I've been told that Buddhist Sanskrit is kind of a little bit different from sort of the Hindu Vedic sort of branch of Sanskrit, and maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I should say Buddhists picked up on Sanskrit much later, maybe potentially 1,000 years into Buddhist history. Actually, we know that's not the case because we have Pragyaparamitas. Very late into Buddhist history, there was the shift away from Pali, which we'll maybe talk about a little more, to Sanskrit. But what's important to know is that it's not just the difference between Buddhist Sanskrit and Hindu Sanskrit. It seems, and this is very frustrating as someone learning Sanskrit, I know you're probably feeling this too, it seems every 50 years, the Sanskrit writers just decide to pick different words. Sanskrit is such a rich language, and it has so many words with so many meanings that, in fact, every example of Sanskrit is just a little bit different, has a little bit of a flavor. So, for example, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are, Itihasas, they're Vedangas, I think. So they're very much in line with a certain, we could say, conservative, traditional Hindu Sanskrit mode. They don't conform to Panini's grammar. They change things. Sometimes they change endings. The verbs are different. The language is different. So for as long as Sanskrit has been written, it's been alive. And so the question isn't so much the difference between Buddhist and Hindu as it is just Sanskrit is this force of creativity and innovation, and it's very poetic, it's very beautiful, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. As for the Buddhist case in particular, you get a very bizarre thing in Buddhism where Buddhists start writing in Pali, and then they move into Sanskrit, a Sanskrit that's so different that some people call it Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. It has sometimes different vocabulary, different grammar, and the differences between Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit and regular Sanskrit are mostly from Pali. So they move into Sanskrit, and then they kind of borrow all the vocab, all the turns of phrase, the way that the sentences are structured in Pali, which points again to the fact that Sanskrit can and was used for many different things. And some people, certainly the Vedas, you should be very careful never to change. The Vedas need to be memorized perfectly. The Vedic Sanskrit has tones similar to Mandarin or, other East Asian languages, which classical Sanskrit does not, or we don't think it does. So Vedic Sanskrit is the static exact thing, but classical Sanskrit, the philosophical language, the literary language, is, I think, a language of expression. Yeah.
So just adding on to the idea that the Vedic Sanskrit had tones. So this is probably why the Vedic chanting, they use all these hand movements, because they're trying to go up and down in tone, and then they're trying to maintain tone. So it's quite interesting how when they're chanting Vedic mantras, they actually use hand movements as a way to regulate tone.
Exactly. Or I've seen videos of Kerala Brahmins take children's heads and move them for every tone. This is this sort of swara, that's this sort of swara.
So that's very interesting. So when we come to classical Sanskrit, we usually think of being established after Panini. So after Panini has his Ashtadhyayi, then he lays down the rules for grammar and how you can combine words and so on. That's when we're looking at sort of the genesis of classical Sanskrit. When would you say this is around, or do we know where this could be?
No. And for two reasons. One, I'm very bad with dates, and I must confess I'm a bit unprepared. And two, most Sanskrit texts have about a 300-year window of composition. So we could say it was BC, I believe, Patanjali. I've seen estimates for the 5th century BC, maybe I'm just making that up. It could be very late. It's difficult to date these things because, and I'm not being glib when I say this, the monsoon washes everything away. The earliest manuscripts we have are really from the 2nd millennium. And so we have some evidence of Gandhari and of very Gandhari inflected Sanskrit preserved from the 2nd century BC, but BCE in the desert because it's very dry and things are written on birch bark. But there's a lot of things to say about dating Patanjali. I'll recuse myself.
So after sort of we get, let's say, the standardization of Sanskrit, right? Most of the texts that most people are familiar with were written in this standard, or as close enough to this standard as possible, so that this would be the Puranas maybe, right? And this is the Sanskrit that most people are aware of, right? When they talk about Sanskrit, it's this classical version that they see in the Puranas, and then they see in other places, and then there's this internal assumption, I guess, among many people that everything in ancient India or the ancient Southeast or South Asia was in Sanskrit. So if I was eating rice and I wanted more rice, I would ask my, whoever's serving rice for me to add more rice in Sanskrit. So there's this assumption that, let's say Nepali and Hindi or whatever, they are all sort of descendants from Sanskrit, and it has been like this constant everywhere, which now we kind of know that, we had Sanskrits, right? Variations on it. But would I ask for rice or ghee if I was just a normal average dude who was, rearing cattle or something, and then I come back home and I want some food to eat? Would I use Sanskrit to do that?
Well, on one hand, I can't tell you because this is something that's difficult to attest to historically, but probably not. So this issue of Hindi and Nepali being descended from Sanskrit, what is happening with Sanskrit, right, is that we have this old Indo-Aryan, and that is what's growing into these many, many languages, Middle Indic languages, which include Saurasheni Prakrit and Magadhi Prakrit and Pali, eventually Apabhramsha, eventually Awadhi into Hindi. So there's this whole move of development from old Indo-Aryan, which the only evidence of that we have is Vedic Sanskrit. Yeah. So maybe in some way, all of these languages are developing from the language of the Vedas. But at the same time that all this development is happening, people are intent on Sanskrit not changing. So they're keeping Sanskrit static. Yeah. So it's less the sense that Nepali and Hindi are developing from it, and more that Nepali and Hindi are developing, just as naturally as any other European language, or Central Asian language. but that what's unique about Sanskrit is that it has this very self-conscious, self-reaffirming process where the minute that Panini did not write the first grammar, I should say. It's the first one we have available. But Panini and Patanjali's commentary kick up this tradition of Vyakarana, grammar, that becomes a science in its own right. And so the next 1,000 years of Sanskrit development are really about everybody reading the Vyakarana and everybody reinforcing this idea of a sort of perfect language. And so from here, we should think about the difference between Sanskrit and Prakrit. So Sanskrit, if we want to break it down into etymology, we can put our Vyakarana hat on. Sam is a prefix that means something like complete. Kr is a root that means to do or to make. Karoti is the verb. So Sanskrita means something that's complete, something that's perfect, something that's in some way ideal. And from there, you get the idea that it's uncreated, that it's eternal, that's the God language. And so the opposite of that should be prakrita, which should mean something like naturally made. So for the longest time, there was this idea that there was Sanskrit, and then there was this ugly cousin of Sanskrit that was just too stupid to be Sanskrit, wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't developed enough to be Sanskrit. And so from Prakrit, from this natural speech, the speech that you're asking for rice, that's the language that gave rise to all of these, contemporary Indian languages that we have today. Unfortunately, again, we don't have proof. Nobody has audio recordings from the 2nd century of somebody asking for rice in Prakrit. What we do have is that Prakrit over and over again is used in very high literary culture, in plays and in poems. The Jains are writing in Prakrit. Many others are writing in Prakrit. Pali can be considered a Prakrit, or the proper term is Middle Indic, right? It's part of this family of languages that we're developing away from Sanskrit. But the fact that these texts survive means that they were texts, that they were languages for wealthy, elite cultural production. And so it's not easy to say that Prakrit is this natural language that was actually spoken. In fact, Prakrit too is also a language of poetry and of drama. And it eventually is exposed to the same pressures that Sanskrit is exposed to. People write Prakrit grammars. People write koshas, where every Prakrit word has a Sanskrit equivalent. And so the language is just as highly theorized. So in terms of what people are speaking, we don't quite know. The closest evidence we can get to, this is an example at the top of my mind, Gandhari. Gandhari is a form of Middle Indic. And we can guess at how it's spoken because we have inscriptions. And generally inscriptions capture the language like it was at a certain point in time. And so we know certain things about how people were speaking Gandhari. We know certain vowel changes, certain facts of the language. But that's about as close as we can get to what people were actually speaking. And so this reinforces the idea that when we're talking about all these documents we have, we really need to think about elite cultural production.
So that's, maybe on the spoken side, like a little bit. There's this, traditional idea, and most people have this idea that Sanskrit, because they've only seen Sanskrit written in Devanagari, for example, right? That is what Sanskrit is in some sense. You have to write Sanskrit in Devanagari, but we know from sources that Devanagari was actually quite late into the script that were there. So how was Sanskrit written, or how was sort of inscriptions made in Sanskrit before Devanagari, and what was the script that was used?
So the emergence of literacy in South Asia is a very complicated issue. But to start with, the claim that the Vedas make is that, well, first of all, that Sanskrit is the best, perfect, eternal language, and that also it should never be written. In fact, to write it is a grievous, grievous sin. So for a long time, it wasn't written, probably because it was prohibited. We don't know. Maybe examples don't survive. But the language Sanskrit is the spoken. It's the actual sounds. It's the aksharas that you're making out into the world, especially if you're chanting mantras or if you're reciting the Vedas. So traditionally, the tradition thinks of itself that Sanskrit is the spoken side and that it can be written in any alphabet. And it has. So it's been written in Ashokan Brahmi, which is the earliest inscriptional evidence we have in India. I've seen it written in a different script called Sharada. You could write it in Thai letters, and it has been written. You could probably write it in Sinhala if you weren't using the Sinhalese alphabet to write Pali. So yeah, it exists in lots of different alphabets, and this generally holds true for other languages as well, Prakrits, and the script is incidental. Yeah.
So it's really the language itself that's that you can write in any. It's almost like you could write French using the Roman alphabet or the Latin alphabet, and you can write Italian using the same alphabet, but then it's a different language. Something like that, I would assume.
Or like you can write Nepali.
Yeah, Nepali.
You can try to write it in
exactly.
Roman. The tricky thing is, and this is what Sanskrit, like proper Sanskrit pundits will say, is that not all writing systems can accommodate all the aksharas. And indeed, I don't know of a writing system that can capture everything in Vedic Sanskrit. Either you're missing the anuswara properly, or you're missing the pitch accents. You know, there's always something missing from a script. I think that's the reason why it's considered imperfect.
So, when we're coming to stuff like mantras and the oral tradition and so on, and we had this idea that, you know, the Sanskrit was largely an oral tradition, and you know, it's been like that till now, till today, right? It's still very much oral. But obviously there's been many manuscripts that have been written in Sanskrit, and right now, if, you know, I were to, let's say, pick up a book that claims to be, you know, written in Sanskrit, or that is written in Sanskrit, I would by default see it in Devanagari, right? Why do you think that is? Why is Devanagari suddenly like the default? You know, even Hindi and Nepali and Marathi, all of these are Devanagari. I mean, obviously the language of, you know, it's of the devas, right? Maybe that has something to do with, you know, Sanskrit being like the language of the gods, and then Devanagari having the devas, you know. Maybe?
Yeah.
Could you take a guess?
So I should begin by saying that I'm not a medievalist, and this is really something that's happening in the medieval period and on, this manuscript culture, maybe a little bit earlier as well. I would answer to that, I mean, you could pick any alphabet and call it Devanagari. So the fact that it's called Devanagari, I mean, doesn't necessarily mean that it's perfectly equipped. I've read in some other alphabets that seem more poorly designed, more poorly suited for Sanskrit. For example, you can see it in Aramaic script in Gandhara.
Oh,
and
wow.
Aramaic script is very, very poorly suited for Sanskrit. So the kind of specifics of why it was Devanagari that emerged are not exactly clear to me, but I will also say most Indic scripts have a lot in common. Most of them seem descended from Brahmi, and so from the beginning of Brahmi, you more or less have the system where you have the consonant and then some marker for the vowel around it. And a lot of the scripts have a very similar, they'll do a bar and a loop for E, or they'll do like a mark up top for O and 2 marks for O. Why it was Devanagari in particular, I mean, do we think maybe in 1,000 years that people will look at Bangla script and Devanagari and say that they're different? Or will they say, oh, it's all the same, you know, they kind of look the same, it's similar, so, yeah.
So when sort of Sanskrit, it seems, was largely a language from, let's say, the western, it moved from northwest to sort of India through, you know, that route, because it came from Central Asia and as a Proto-Indo-European sort of descendant. And in the south of India, they speak a language that is totally unrelated to Sanskrit. They speak Tamil and most Dravidian languages. So these two, did these two mix at any time? Were there sort of interactions between these two languages? Was there anything going on that front?
This is, again, something that's very difficult to attest to historically. What we know is that generally the idea of an Aryan invasion has been disproven. It does look like the advance of Indo-Aryan languages into the Indian subcontinent was probably much more gradual and much more
Migratory?
we could say peaceful, probably migratory, yeah. And this is evidenced by the many words we think might be loaned from Dravidian languages. So much so that part of Panini's job, part of any grammarian's job, is to explain how Sanskrit words come from roots. And so modern linguists have noticed all these moments where Panini will make up a root for a Tamil word that does not have a proper Sanskrit root because it's an open issue. Clearly in the language, there were all these Dravidian influences and people were using these words. But when it came time to standardize the language and to figure out, a big part of a grammarian's job is to see the verb karoti and know, that's a third person singular verb. And it came from the root kr. So it became part of grammar's job to shore up Sanskrit as a conceptual unity, and the Dravidian influence was lost. But again, this is something that's difficult to attest to. But we do know from inscriptional evidence that Tamil is a very old language, just as old as classical Sanskrit. It was used for a long time, and the two have existed on the subcontinent for about as long as we have evidence for.
Nice. So, the idea that there was an Aryan invasion is a pretty controversial idea, and that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of political movements around language as such, especially in India nowadays. So what we're saying is that historians nowadays kind of have debunked this idea of the Aryan invasion theory, and it was more migratory, it was slow, it was gradual, and so on. When we come back to Sanskrit and sort of how it grew, can we sort of, using the language itself, using the words, right, figure out when this particular sort of, let's say if I'm reading a manuscript or something, right, or so can we, using the language itself, figure out when that was composed or that was written or something, or is that too difficult?
I mean, you're thinking like a historical linguist, which I unfortunately am not. I very much am squarely in the realm of comparatively pretty late Sanskrit, 5th, 6th century. So again, that's something I'm ignorant about, but certainly historical linguists are trying. There's evidence linking the redaction of the Vedas to Avestan influence through the Achaemenid Empire, right, through the Persians, suggesting that from the redaction of the language at that point, we can try to date exactly when the Vedas came together. Again, it's all very difficult. It's out of my pay grade. People are working on it, but we don't have a silver bullet, partly because even from that period, we don't have a lot of inscriptional evidence. Now talking about literature in Sanskrit, we have a lot of religious and philosophical texts, but we also have a lot of non-religious and non-philosophical, more of a literature style. We have plays, we have poems, we have so can you elaborate a bit more on this, and when we start getting these plays and when we start getting Sanskrit used as a literary device instead of just purely like a religious philosophical and the language of the Vedas and so on. One of the very earliest Shastras we have, one of the very earliest Sanskrit texts, is Bharata's Natya Shastra. So presumably the Vedas were written very far before, but as far as we know, Natya was there from the very beginning of the history that we have access to. So again, we should think about Sanskrit, especially classical Sanskrit, as this language of elite cultural production. And on that topic, I guess this is a good time to think about Shastra and what it's doing. It seems that Shastra is very integral to classical Sanskrit and to what classical Sanskrit is good for. And Shastra is an interesting category because it collapses what we like to think of as the religious spheres and the philosophical spheres and the literary spheres, right? Maybe we can define it like this. Religion is the sphere of normative claims, right? What you should do. Philosophy is some sort of analytical, argument about what is or what we have access to. And literature is just the sphere of beauty and aesthetic pleasure. But this way of framing it is very Western.
Yeah.
And in fact, Shastra does all of it.
Yeah.
So if you look at something like Natya Shastra, it isn't clear what's philosophy and what's maybe normative religious thought. Or if you're looking at praise poems, for example, bhakti praise poems, is that literature, is that religion? How do you think it is? Something like the Bhagavad Gita, is that doing religion, or is it doing literature because it is a Gita, it's a song, and it is quite beautiful when you hear it spoken. But what I wanted to say about Shastra is that what is unique about Sanskrit, to my knowledge, and I'm pulling from the language of Sheldon Pollock here, the logic of Shastra as a mode of Sanskritic production is that theory precedes practice. So anywhere else, I mean, certainly in the Western tradition, there's the sense that people are doing things out in the world, right? People are cooking recipes.
Yeah.
And then after people have been cooking for a while, somebody gets it in their head, I'm going to write them down. And then you have theory about cooking and what temperature the thing should be on and where the pot should go and what vegetables you should cook with. But Shastric writers in India, I'm thinking about Vatsyayana here, the author of the Kama Sutra, is insistent that in India, theory precedes practice. That is to say, if you did not have Kama Shastra, you could not have sex. like you could be having it, but it wouldn't be really Kama. If the Shastra, you might not know the Shastra, but in fact the theory exists and the theory has existed forever, right? This is a way that classical Sanskrit pulls on the Vedic tradition, because classical Sanskrit, especially Shastra, insofar as it presents itself as a Vedanga, as a limb of the Vedas, also pulls that sense of eternality, borrows on the Vyakarana idea of an eternal relationship between the word and the meaning of the word. And so what you get is just an enormous amount of theory about how to have sex, theory about how to train elephants, theory about what kings can and should do. And so Shastra, kind of like grammar, becomes this area in which Sanskrit is reinforcing itself as the origin of all knowledge, right? The fact that it's written in Sanskrit, the fact that it's there in a Shastra, and that the Shastra is exhaustive. It tells you, what rings to put on and when to put them on and when to walk and how to walk and who to speak to and when to speak to them. The fact that it's exhaustive is proof in one way that it's a worthy language, worthy of intellectual production and of literature.
Yeah. Coming to the ways that Sanskrit has been written, we talked about, the Gita being a song, for example. And much of Sanskrit literature is written in the form of poetry or in meters, as we would call it, chanda. So what is a chanda? Could you explain to me what a chanda is and why that's important to Sanskrit?
So a chanda is, I think a good analogy is like the Western scale system to the Indian rag system. You could think about meter as in the West you only have a couple of meters really, especially in English. You have iambic tetrameter or you have trochaic tetrameter. You can change how many groups of words are in every sentence, but you only have a few. In the same way that you have so many rags in India, you have so many chandas. And chandas are defined by, you can have chandas where there's, I should go back a little. I'm getting ahead of myself. In a verse, you would have 16 syllables. 8, 8, and then in a second verse, 8, 8. So that's traditionally what we would call a shloka chanda. Or, a shloka chanda. So the opening line of the Raghuvamsha is a good example. Vagartha vivasamprikto, vagartha pratipattaye, jagatah pitaro vande, parvati parameshwara. You see how that has a very kind of specific rhythm. And so loosely a chanda is that sort of rhythm. Except they can get very, very specific. Shardula Vikridita, for example, has 21 syllables in a verse. Eke sat purushaha parartha ghataka svartham parityajyaye. So we don't know what the melodies were, but we know that the rhythm is that way. And the rhythm is established by whether or not a syllable has a long vowel or a short vowel. So often when Sanskrit writers are writing, they're not writing in prose like we're speaking. They're not just stringing words together. They have, this is remarkable to me, Latin poets do this too, Greek poets also, they have the words come to them in the meter. Things come to you with a certain metrical pattern. And so the aesthetic value of that, how beautiful that is, especially if it's being sung, it can't be ignored. And scholars often do ignore it. Yeah. But I think it's still an open question why philosophy in India is written in shlokas. Why would that be the case? When sometimes it makes it harder to read. Yeah, you can imagine definitely, when it has to be poetic. Part of it is that it's easier to comment on shlokas. But sorry.
So would, let's say, given that there's a shloka or a particular, text that's supposedly written in a certain chanda, let's say, right? How would that help towards preserving it in the oral tradition? Because if you know that it's in a particular chanda, then would it make it easier to remember maybe? Or is it a memorization tool as well? Or what is it functioning as?
So I said that it's just to be pretty, because that's how I look at everything. But you're right. It has very important functions in terms of the manuscript tradition. If it's very easy, because manuscripts, I don't know if anyone in the audience has ever seen a manuscript. They're awful. Yeah, there's no spaces between the letters. It's scribbled. Sometimes it's falling apart. Yeah. And because of the climate conditions, especially kind of farther south in India, there you could just have holes in the manuscript. And so what a meter tells you is that you need a long or a short akshara in a particular place. Yeah. And so even if there's a hole there, you can kind of guess what it is. I can give a personal example. Last month I was in Varanasi and I went to the Vishwanatha temple. And there's a little waiting area for foreigners. There's like a little bureau where you have to buy a ticket and show your passport. And I was sitting there and there were shlokas from the Kashikanda, I think, on the walls, or maybe it was from the Shiva Purana, I don't know. But I looked at it and I recognized that the meter was Vasanta Tilaka. Na 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 na. So I was reading them. And my Sanskrit isn't that good. I need a dictionary for everything. But I was reading it, and I think I found 3 typos on that wall. Because there were long syllables where there should be short syllables, and in one case there was a whole syllable missing. Yeah. So when a syllable is missing, the rhythm of the line doesn't make sense. And so the whole thing is wrong. And so, of course, I did look up the verse, and unfortunately they were wrong. Someone needs to change those signs. But so that should tell you the utility of having these chandas. It makes it easier to memorize things, and it makes it very easy to catch errors because things just sound wrong to your ear.
Yeah. Coming to this, idea that Sanskrit is a very sort of, it has meters, there's a rhythm to it. You pick up a book on Sanskrit and all you see are tables nowadays, right? There's just a bunch of tables. There's tables and everything is categorized right. And then there's tables and there's supposedly, like even the letters themselves, right? They fall into categories. So I guess everybody maybe knows how the kakha gagha they go from being more of a guttural source to coming sort of upwards towards the lips. Could you elaborate on this categorization of the letters and the grammar itself? Because why are there so many tables when I'm trying to go to a Sanskrit book?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I will say sometimes when people are talking about how Sanskrit is so exceptional and so special, I kind of roll my eyes because I don't like to mythologize the things that I study to that extent. But this is one area in which Sanskrit got it right the first time. It's a brilliant way of organizing your alphabet because it's very anatomical. The gutturals, the ka, ka, ga, ga start in your throat, and everything moves forward until you get to the sibilants, the sha, sa. Or sorry, the labials, the ma, ba, ba. The sibilants are at different places. And every letter has a voiced version and an unvoiced version. Ka, ga, an aspirated ka, and an aspirated ka. This should not come as any surprise to any speaker of any South Asian language. This is a real innovation in how to organize your alphabet. Japanese, for example, the Japanese hiragana and katakana systems are organized in the same way.
Oh, wow.
And the fact that they're gaki, ku, keiko, that vowel system is borrowed from Sanskrit.
Okay, I didn't know that. I knew that they had like a similar sort of vibe going on, but I didn't know that it had a relationship. Probably it was the Buddhists who maybe took it.
Probably was Japanese Buddhists, But so that's a really interesting thing, and I think that's a byproduct of this obsession with categorization. That's just what Sanskrit does. It produces produces knowledge. I mean, you can think about every early Sanskrit writer, many early Sanskrit writers, as these sort of encyclopedia makers, where like everything kind of has to have this almost scientific character. And this is why you'll often hear people talking about Sanskrit as the original scientific language, or the Mahabharata having the first example of a nuclear bomb, things like that. But in terms of linguistically, it's very advanced. And I will say, Western scholars, Western philosophers, for example, often ignore the contributions of Indian philosophers because they can't read Sanskrit and they don't really care about it. Western linguists found Panini in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they ate him up. Like, linguistics continues to be one of the fields where old Indian, Sanskrit writers have made an impact because people saw this system of organizing phonetics and this system of thinking about grammar, and it kind of clicked with where scientific linguistics was at that point in time, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's quite amazing to hear. How grammarians of the Indian subcontinent, let's say, or South Asia, they've been so incessant on categorizing almost to a scientific degree. And obviously now, there's a lot of people that, try to shore up everything. There's rumors that, code is being written in Sanskrit and so on, and people start believing these things, and it starts... But I think faking this this utility or the amazing character of Sanskrit, which is what they're doing. They're essentially faking or exaggerating it to such a point that it's comical, right? Yeah. And that actually robs the language of its actual beauty.
Exactly. Right. It's just really cool. You don't have to make it any cooler than it already is. It's a really cool language. Do you have to spend basically a full year of your life memorizing everything before you can even start learning it? Yeah. Yes, you do. That is how it works for the most part. But once you memorize things, you can say things much more compactly. Do we have time to get into cases? No. Lovely.
So, I think as an introduction, as a very basic, just a glimpse of what Sanskrit is and so on, I think we've touched on quite a number of points, important points. And I think it's very much a language that's worth studying today. And it opens up, as you might have experienced, a huge, vast amount of literature to explore. And it really brings out a lot of everything from, music and poetry, theater,
and philosophy. If you're like a boring person who doesn't have anything better to do with their life, you can do philosophy. There's also literature.
I hope that wasn't about me. But so it's really a language that's really beautiful, I think, and worth studying. And then, like you said, we shouldn't be mythologizing it, right? We should look at the language for what it is, and that's what actually makes it beautiful, because it is still a living tradition for many, many people, right? And the fact that it's living and it was growing and it did evolve and so on actually adds to the beauty, instead of it being this static, thing that we just consider as being there from the beginning, and that was it. And so yeah, it's a pretty good discussion, I think.
Yeah.